Let me start this out with a question first. What is the underlying question posed to the player within the Panzer Dragoon games? Now I know this isn't generally a question many people ask, let alone even think about when it comes to this particular franchise. No, generally the discussion either deals with the play mechanics of its rail shooter entries or it pertains to Saga, with Saga generally taking up much of the internet's attention admittedly. But for the sake of this video, none of that will be the actual focus. See, while the story of the franchise's rocky history is clearly interesting, I personally feel like that topic and a litany of others have already been done to death. So before I go any further down that tangential black hole, back to the question at hand. What is the underlying question posed to the player? Now I asked this very same question to a number of people, but only after asking a primer question first. What is the message of the Panzer Dragoon games? While this may seem redundant to ask, it's imperative that we understand that asking a player a question and trying to present an overall message are two distinct things. As for their answers, the overwhelming response from all those involved could easily be paraphrased as one word: hope. That our futures are what we make of them. After inquiring about what exactly that meant to many, the responses I garnered reminded me of an infamous line from the first Terminator movie: "The future is not set." Now in all fairness, this premise is exactly what I thought for many years. Throughout the franchise, we, the character, find ourselves thrust into the position of hero or savior. Not just one to defeat some evil corporation, world-conquering army, or some lunatic scientist, as is the case with many other games, but instead we find ourselves the savior of our own doomed world, facing off against the horrors of our own species' past, fighting against the very world that was fated upon us long before we even existed. See, if I'm being completely honest, this video is a primer to a much longer video, one that I've been working on for the better part of a year. The research for that video, replaying the games numerous times earlier this year, and really delving deep into the lore and backstory of the games, all of this has led me to question many previously held notions I had about the roles of the lead characters in each game, and moreover, just how much choice they really had. But more than anything, it led me to an answer to that original question I posed at the start of this video. What is the underlying question posed to the player within the Panzer Dragoon games? That answer being, must the sins of the father be visited upon his children? So welcome to the channel. I'm the SSG, and this is Panzer Dragoon, a question of fate and the sins of our fathers. There will be spoilers, a lot of them. Player agency. I know that's quite the weird way to try to start a conversation, but it is what we have to discuss first. See, a unique problem that game developers have is trying to convey a measure of agency to the player. Before the advent, or more precisely the flood of open world games that we have today, presenting player agency in a believable fashion wasn't all that easy. Sure, most games pre-5th gen weren't firing on all cylinders trying to corral the player into their world, making them feel like they were actually a part of it, but having a player invest their time in a game at all still required them to care about the outcome. In gaming's earliest days, this was simply accomplished with high scores, unlockable extras, or differing paths on subsequent playthroughs. But as gaming developed and more games started to merge story with gameplay in a fundamental way, the need for those worlds to be believable, or at least somewhat immersive, began to rise. The Panzer Dragoon franchise is one such example of this early style of merging. Ask any fan of the Panzer Dragoon series today what they like the most about the games, and it's almost a given that they will respond with comments regarding the fast-paced rail shooter mechanics, the intricate boss and level designs, or the awesome soundtrack that accompany them. Very seldom will you hear anything about a story, that is unless you talk to someone who's played Saga. While all three of the rail shooter entries do present a story or narrative to the player, they aren't presented in a way where the player has to invest themselves in it. And unless someone plays Saga or at the very least looks into Pandora's box after beating Orta, there's very little chance they would even understand or grasp how large a world the devs actually created for them. And this is where the matter of player agency comes into the picture, or put a different way, your agency comes into play. Much like the devs made a choice to implement a story, you have just as much the opportunity to make a choice to invest yourself in said story. Now I'm sure there's someone thinking, well duh, every single game gives the player that same option. That's just how games work. And while I can't say you're wrong, in the case of Panzer Dragoon, the entire story is quite literally about choice, and how our fates deprive us of much of it. All throughout this epic saga that makes up the Panzer Dragoon franchise, we find our characters willfully deciding to put themselves in harm's way, all in an attempt to save their world from the horrors of its own past, and create a better future. This is initially what led me, like a great many others, to believe that the stories were in fact ones of hope, overcoming one's own past and taking back our own lives. That was at least the case until I truly started to look at what role the Dragon had in these stories. And by Dragon, what I actually mean is the Heresy program. For those of you who have no idea what the Heresy program is, get ready for a crash course in Panzer Dragoon's ancient history. The world that is presented to us in-game is quite literally the remnants of a shattered world, one that thousands of years ago faced untold devastation by the hands of its very own inhabitants. They not only destroyed their own biosphere, but also erased entire nations, making glass of the very rock upon which they built their once thriving civilization. It was only after this terrible calamity that they started to rebuild their world once more, but there existed an insurmountable chasm amongst the remaining populace. There were those who wished to utilize the very technology that had led to their own ruin in the hopes of recreating their prosperous world, and those who wished for that very same technology to be erased from the history of man, never to see the light of day again. This technology preservation faction and the opposing destruction faction were never able to find any form of discourse between one another, at least not one of civility. No, the only discourse they would ever know was that of war. That is, if you can even classify such a horrific thing as a war. The Preservation faction followed through with their plans to rebuild their world through what would become known as the Tower Initiative, a scheme to quite literally become the very gods of their own world, and as a result, fully control their own destiny. This initiative consisted of global terraforming engines, an army of bioengineered machinations to tend to their world, semi-autonomous workers who would maintain the towers, unrelenting defenders of those very same towers, and most importantly, an AI to act as a command and control module for the whole network. But even with this grand plan in effect, its infrastructure built, and its mechanisms in motion, there was one piece left. See, the Preservation faction's destiny would never be possible unless the plague that had brought humanity to the brink of extinction was finally quelled and placed under control. That plague was humanity itself. This would not be accomplished through placing the populace in designated areas or any other form of peaceful resolution. This would be accomplished by the deliberate reduction of the human population, and subsequently, the maintaining of that quantity by whatever means necessary. What followed this turn of events should be obvious. When faced with the possibility of complete and utter genocide as their inevitable fate, the Destruction faction laid aside their ideals and aspirations. They picked up the very tools they so loathed and fought tooth and nail against a force many times their superior. They fought as their homes, their cities, even their very friends and family were all wiped from existence. And all the while they plotted and schemed, stole the very technology used to bring about their end, and as a last-ditch effort, they created the Heresy program. This program was their Trojan horse, their ultimate act. No matter the result of their assaults upon the Preservation faction and their towers, this program would inevitably enact their vengeance. And in what may have been their final offensive on the Preservation faction, they were successfully able to upload the program to the tower's AI network. These were the sins of our many characters' forefathers, starting with the world they had laid to waste, the Preservation faction's Tower Initiative, and inevitably the Destruction faction's own Heresy program. All these choices quite literally follow our characters throughout their journeys, thousands of years later, and by extension, they have stripped away much of the agency our characters may have held otherwise. Understanding this history is what finally led me to that underlying question, and in the case of the Panzer Dragoon games, the answer to that question is simple and unequivocal. Yes. Throughout our journey in Panzer Dragoon's shattered landscape, we consistently find ourselves being pushed forward toward an inevitable conflict with our father's sins. While Saga is most eloquent in describing this mission as fighting against the quote-unquote will of the ancients, it's just as much the case that we are still carrying out their will. In fact, we are carrying out the most clear will of any ancient faction. The central AI that governs the tower network, Sestrin, is carrying out the Preservation faction's directives, but the infrastructure for this goal is crumbling by the time the games take place. The towers are now in ruins, slumbering as if their directives have been accomplished. The bioengineered creatures needed to maintain the network's infrastructure and keep humanity's population in check have mutated, virtually killing off what little remains of the natural fauna. The drones needed for controlling the towers, their access portals, and their dragon defenders are now a thing of myth and legend, with only 3 ever being presented to the character throughout the franchise. In every respect, Sestrin has failed at its mission to revitalize a barren world, and if we take Orta's narrative into account, it has even failed at preserving its very own creators. The only thing it has accomplished has been the systemic reduction of the human population, and in turn their ability to shape their own destiny, whether that be by directly attacking them or by nature of its failure as a properly functioning terraforming system. This all stands in stark contrast to the current state of the destruction faction's will. They wished for the Tower Network to fall. They created the Heresy program to accomplish this singular task, and it has been ever persistent in that mission. This is where I feel I need to stop and clear up a few things. In general, there are many commonly held misconceptions regarding what fate and free will actually are. Furthermore, these misconceptions can easily allow one to believe that they have more agency or rather control over their own lives than they actually do. Put bluntly, the idea that one can avert or change their fate is inherently wrong. Fate does not account for your actions, but rather those performed by others, specifically those of your past. To make it even simpler, your fate is predetermined. The destiny of our characters and their world is an entirely different issue altogether. Destiny is in fact what we make of it. It is entirely dependent upon our choices and the agency that drives them. See, here's the fundamental issue with free will, or rather its primary component. Agency is what actually guides us in the choices we make. This agency can be based on societal norms, economic pressures, fight or flight instincts, or even anger. But unless that agency is based upon rational thought, it is no more free will than pulling your hand back from a hot stove. And in every single instance that our characters first meet the dragon, they all find themselves in situations where their actions are based upon emotion and not the common rationale of their contemporaries. Lundy chose to use compassion in fear of what may happen to the mutated Kuya puppy found instead of following the village's laws. Kyle was shown visions of horrible ruin that would befall his world, and faced even more ancient monsters if he turned back alone. Edge had just been saved after barely escaping Destiny's clutches mere minutes before, and Orta was locked away for years, only to be saved from dragon mares at the last moment. All of these instances were fated upon them, a path they were forced to face, and in every case they were deprived of much of the agency they would have had it not been for their forefathers' transgressions. The very idea of inherited sin or inherited misery, as is the case with many pagan beliefs, is something many people wish to reject. When we think our lives are outside of our control, we grow angry and combative, but this is precisely why concepts like fate and destiny are so misunderstood. In the context of Panzer Dragoon, fate and destiny are very much intertwined, with free will being a blurry mirage at best. Our characters never truly have the option to choose a life of their own, because the Heresy program has chosen them first. They are merely the components of a millennia-long war between long-dead factions. They are the necessary riders, the ones to defeat the towers, the one who must sacrifice himself to destroy the network, and finally the one who by her very birth was fated to span the horrors of the past and present. None of them were willful masons of their own destinies. They are merely unknowing agents of their forebears' wills, and in turn they must inherit their sins. While many people view these games as ending on hopeful notes, with the exception of Orta, all of them end with the characters stripped of something dear. And in retrospect, in all three of the Saturn games, our lead characters are left with a world not much better than it was before, if they're even alive. I understand why people view them this way. Hell, I did the same for many years. Our characters defeat humanity's nemesis, we free ourselves of the Ancient's will, and return our ability to truly shape our own destiny. By any measure, what I just described should be seen as a hopeful message, but none of it is the actual truth. Defeating a few towers does not stop the monsters that already exist. Destroying Cestrin didn't just lead to grass growing and birds chirping. Quite to the contrary, destroying it led to the remaining towers losing complete control of the environment. This led to massive storms, entire continents shifting, more and more death. And lastly, it still did not stop those bioengineered creatures that already exist. The will of the ancients still held dominance over their world, and they would continue to suffer from it. And while Orta's story is different to a degree, she still suffers from her forebears' transgressions. But by her very existence, there exists the possibility of a hopeful future. She acts as a merger of the ancient world and the new, a half-human drone hybrid. Her mother, Orta, was the one stolen from the Preservation Faction's Uru lab those many thousands of years ago, and the one who opened the portal to Cestrin for Edge. And while her father's identity is never explicitly stated, most assume it to be Edge as well. What this means is that she can interact with the ancient texts scattered across the globe, communicate on an intimate level with her human contemporaries, and she can begin to mend the world torn apart by this millennia-old conflict between two ancient factions. Out of all the characters, she has the greatest degree of free agency, but even then, her choices and destiny have still been shaped by her fated birth. This is the message of Panzer Dragoon, one of many, but one that I feel is the most pertinent, especially in our current times. That we cannot escape the very fate that we were given by our birth, that if we fail to take our own agency in this life, that we will be destined to inherit the very sins of our forebears, that we will continue a doomed cycle of hostility towards enemies that are not of our choosing. So I'll ask this question once more. must the sins of the father be visited upon his children? For the world of Panzer Dragoon, the answer is simple. I hope, for our sake, that we choose differently. As always, this is the SSG. This is me, signing out.